this movie, we're going to look at tracking, a close cousin of kerning. Tracking also refers to the adjustment of space between characters, but specifically across a range of characters. There are several instances when you may want to track, and a common use of tracking is to fix spacing and composition problems, such as widows and orphans and short lines. Let's take a look at how we can solve these common problems. A single line of a paragraph that has been disassociated with the other lines of that paragraph definitely needs fixing. Had this been the first line of the paragraph that was at the bottom of the page, this would have been a widow. That's the distinction between them. I think I have to admit I sometimes get the two confused, but they are related concepts, and the solution is the same. I'm going to select this whole paragraph down here by clicking in it 4 times, and I'm going to apply some negative tracking across this paragraph. I want to get away with as little as possible. So I have my preferences set in units and increments. And for Windows users, your preferences are under the Edit menu. My kerning preference, which also applies to tracking, I had that set to 5/1/1000 M. And now, when I press the Option key, or the Alt plus left arrow once, we can see there is my tracking field. I have gone to -5. That's not enough in this case to fix the problem. So I'm going to try another one. Come back down. Select the text, -10, and it looks like that will do the job. I would suggest that you don't want to have more than -15. Any more than -15 and your reader is going to notice that you've been tightening up the space here, loosening up the space there, and your text is going to have a kind of unpleasant effect. And we want to keep the rhythm constant, and we want to keep the spacing consistent. But -10 fixes the problem, and that's a big improvement. Now let's look at tracking a short line, which is the same solution. And here we have a second paragraph that runs to just a single word. I think it would look better if this word were brought up to the previous line. I'm going to fix this problem by selecting the paragraph by clicking on it 4 times, and then using the keyboard shortcut Option or Alt, left arrow, and one go on that is enough to do it. -5, 1/1000 M tracking applied. And it appears that one click with -5 does the job. That's how tracking is used to fix different format problems within a document. Let's take a look at how this text has been hyphenated, because at its most basic we apply hyphenation simply by checking this box. But we need to go further. We need to be more rigid and more controlled about how hyphenation is being applied. And we can do this through the hyphenation dialog box. Of course, it can also be applied as part of a paragraph style. So I'm going to go to my Additional Options drop-down menu and go to the hyphenation settings. And I like to be a bit more restrictive with my hyphenation. So I allow it to happen, but I don't want to see too much of it. So I increase this form by default value of 5 to 6. And I say that I want 3 characters before and after the hyphen. I make the hyphen limit 1. The hyphenation zone is irrelevant for the type of text that I'm using, because I'm also using a paragraph composer that makes the hyphenation zone irrelevant. Hyphenate capitalized words, sometimes I will have this checked, sometimes not. It really depends upon the nature of the text I'm working with and how many capitalized words there are likely to be. But I will always have these 2 unchecked. I don't want hyphenation break across the column or a hyphenation break to occur in the last word of a paragraph. Now these settings are just my own. You may set things up a little bit differently depending on your preferences and also depending on the kind of type that you're working with. So those are my preferred settings. If we look in the hyphenation dialog box, we can see that the hyphenation limit is set to 3. We can sometimes get results where we have 2 hyphens on 2 different lines of text in a row. And we definitely want to avoid the stepladder effect occurring on the right-hand side of our text. Simply by changing the hyphen limit to 1, we avoid the problem. I mentioned earlier the feature of the hyphenation zone and how it doesn't have any effect when working with text that has an Adobe Paragraph Composer applied to it, which in my case is all of my text. I prefer to work with the Adobe Paragraph Composer as opposed to the single line composer. But when you are working with the single line composer, you can affect the amount of hyphenation with the hyphenation zone. Now it's a bit counterintuitive, but the higher the value of the hyphenation zone, the fewer hyphens you will have. So here on the left-hand side, I have the hyphenation zone set to 0, and we have several hyphens within this body of text. Here I have the hyphenation zone set to 3 picas, and with a 3 pica hyphenation zone, it can reduce the number of hyphens. Now if I were to come in and increase the hyphenation zone, let's say I make it 6 picas, I will uncheck my preview and then check it again. You can see that that is enough to effectively eradicate all hyphens from this document. So a little bit counterintuitive there, but that's how it works. The higher the value of the hyphen zone, the fewer hyphens you will get. Now hyphens aren't necessarily a bad thing, but you don't want to have too many of them because it just looks unprofessional and can be distracting. If you collaborate across platforms or you work with multiple platforms yourself, most of the incompatibility problems have been worked out between the platforms, with the exception of fonts. Font formats can still become an issue. For example, Windows can't directly read Mac, PostScript, or TrueType fonts. Although Macs can read PC TrueType fonts, but it's kind of an annoyance to activate them. As a most modern font format, OpenType offers the most flexibility. It's completely cross-platform. That is, the same font file can be used both on a PC and a Mac, as long as you comply with font licensing. That alone would be pretty awesome, but the appeal of OpenType fonts lies in their expanded character set. An OpenType font can contain more than 38,000 characters. Why would you ever need so many characters? Well, for multiple language publishing, which was one of the main inspirations for the creation of the OpenType format. Myriad Pro, for example, includes Central European diacriticals and Greek characters and even more. And it goes beyond that. Caslum Pro includes some ornaments, and many OpenType fonts include special features such as swash characters and discretionary ligatures. In the past, when we were using PostScript or TrueType fonts, we had to have separate font files for each one of those special features. Now that we have so many characters within a font, we can have them all in one font. So let's take a look at some of the options. If I select all of this text, usually ligatures is on by default, but I've turned them off just so I can show you something. Look at the FFL in Waffle Stompers. And when I turn ligatures on, it makes such a nice little combination. That FFL is actually a special little character within the OpenType font. It's very nicely created. There's also something called discretionary ligatures. But before I apply that, I want you to look at that list of features. All of these features could be in one OpenType font. Not all OpenType fonts will have all of these features. Those features for this font that are displayed in brackets are not available for this font. I want you to watch the S and the T in distress when I choose discretionary ligatures. That's not what you think of when you think of ligatures, is it? You think of FL or FI or FFL. You wouldn't think about having a ligature between an S and a T, but the designers of this font thought that that would be a neat idea, and because OpenType supports it, they got to do it. Now let's talk about fractions and ordinals. Some OpenType fonts support what they are called arbitrary fractions. Use OpenType and fractions if that's available for this font. Well, there you go. That's not a lot of work. I'm going to select all of this text and choose OpenType and fractions. Pretty good, but the 1116 doesn't look so great. So I'd have to work with that a little bit. So in some fonts, this works very well. In some fonts, maybe not so well. Let's see what happens when I change the font of this 1116. I'm using Adobe Garamond Pro. If I try Myrid Pro, that's not bad. So you'll find that Myrid Pro is pretty good, no matter what your numbers are. So I'm going to try one more time to see if I can get a decent fraction here. Again, if they're not perfect in the font that you have your heart set on, it's still not as much work as we had to apply in the past to make fractions. Also, some OpenType fonts support ordinals. So here if I choose OpenType and ordinals, that's available for this font. Think how much work that saved you. Isn't that cool? So that's the beauty of OpenType fonts. And that's why 38,000 characters, well, that's a great playground. So that's briefly how tracking, hyphenation, and OpenType works.